Get this parasite out of my sight before I throw her stuff into the street, my mother screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my sobbing sister. We were standing in the sterile, brightly lit consultation room of the city hospital, and the ink on the DNA results was barely dry. My sister, Qley, was 22 years old and hooked up to an 4 drip, her face pale and sunken from stage for kidney failure. The doctor had a look of absolute horror on his face when he delivered the news that Qley shared 0% of her DNA with either of my parents. A clerical error at a chaotic, understaffed suburban hospital 22 years ago had resulted in 2 newborn babies being swapped. Qley, the sweet, gentle girl my parents had raised since she was a tiny infant, was not their biological child. My father, Richard, did not drop to his knees in grief, nor did he hug his dying daughter to comfort her through this existential nightmare. Instead, he slowly stood up, straightened his expensive silk tie, and stared at Qley as if she were a piece of rotten meat he had accidentally stepped on. So we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars raising a stranger's defective brat while our real flesh and blood was out there, Richard sneered, his voice dripping with pure disgust. I stood between my parents and Qley, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to process the sheer cruelty of the people who raised me. "Are you completely out of your minds?" I yelled, my voice echoing off the sterile walls of the hospital room. "Qley is your daughter. She has been your daughter for 22 years, and she is fighting for her life right now." My mother, Evelyn, scoffed loudly and crossed her arms, refusing to even look at Qley, who was hyperventilating into her hospital gown. "She is not my daughter. She is a fraudulent stranger who has taken up space and resources that belong to my real child," Evelyn hissed. "I want to know where my biological daughter is, and I want this imposter out of my house by the time we get back." I looked at my parents, realizing for the first time in my 26 years that they were absolute monsters. They had always been obsessed with status, wealth, and their perfect family image. But this was a level of cold-blooded depravity I did not know existed. Evelyn and Richard turned on their heels and walked out of the hospital room, leaving Qley sobbing so hard she began to choke. I immediately rushed to Qley's side, holding her trembling hands and rubbing her back as she wept into my chest. "Leo, please tell me this is a dream," Qley whispered between ragged, painful breaths. "Am I really not your sister? Do they really hate me now?" she cried, her voice cracking with a pain that broke my heart into a million pieces. "You are my sister, and you will always be my sister, no matter what some piece of paper says," I promised her, squeezing her cold hands. "I will never leave you, Qley, and I will make sure you get the treatment you need, even if I have to spend every single penny I have." The next morning, Qley was temporarily discharged with a prescription for heavy medication while we waited for a donor match. When I drove her back to my parents' estate to collect her belongings, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. All of Qley's clothes, her childhood photo albums, her textbooks, and her favorite stuffed animals were stuffed into black trash bags. They had been thrown onto the gravel driveway in the pouring rain, soaking through the plastic and ruining decades of memories. Evelyn stood on the grand front porch, holding a steaming cup of tea, watching us with an expression of smug satisfaction. "The locks have been changed, Leo, so do not bother trying to use your key," Evelyn called out over the sound of the rain. "If that girl attempts to step foot on our property again, I will have the security guards arrest her for trespassing." I stepped out of the car, ignoring the heavy rain, and marched up the stone steps until I was inches from my mother's face. "You are a pathetic, miserable excuse for a human being, and you will rot in hell for what you are doing to her," I spat. Evelyn merely smiled, a cold, empty expression that made my skin crawl. "We have hired a private investigator, and he has already located our real daughter," Evelyn said proudly. "Her name is Maya, and she was raised by a very wealthy real estate family in Chicago, which is exactly where she belongs. She is refined, beautiful, and most importantly, she's actually my blood, unlike the charity case you're holding on to." I did not waste another second speaking to her. I turned around, loaded Qley's ruined belongings into my trunk, and drove away. I took Qley to my 2-bedroom apartment in the city, which I had purchased with my own money from my career as a cloud architect. Qley spent the first 3 days in a state of catatonic shock, staring at the wall and refusing to eat anything but broth. I took a leave of absence from my job, dedicating every hour of my day to cooking for her, managing her medications, and researching donor registries. Meanwhile, my parents wasted no time in executing their plan to bring their biological daughter, Maya, into their lives. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that they had flown to Chicago, met Maya, and practically begged her to move into their mansion. What my parents did not know, because they were too blinded by their obsession with status, was the truth about Maya's background. My private investigator, whom I hired the moment my parents abandoned Qley, uncovered a goldmine of disturbing information about Maya. Maya had indeed been raised by a wealthy family, but she had been legally disowned by them 6 months prior. She was a pathological liar and a highly skilled con artist who had embezzled $300,000 from her adoptive father's charity. She had avoided jail time only because her adoptive family wanted to avoid a massive public scandal, choosing to quietly cut her off instead. Maya was swimming in credit card debt, facing multiple lawsuits from former friends she had scammed, and was desperately looking for a way out. When Evelyn and Richard showed up in their designer clothes, crying about how she was their long-lost biological heir, Maya saw her next big mark. She immediately played the part of the grieving, long-lost daughter, weeping into Evelyn's arms and pretending she was a successful fashion boutique owner. Within a week, Maya had moved into my parents' guest house, and she began systematically draining their bank accounts. She convinced my father that she needed $50,000 to relocate her boutique business to our city. She convinced my mother that she needed a brand new Range Rover to fit in with the country club crowd, which my parents gladly bought for her. While my parents were busy throwing lavish welcome home parties for their new criminal daughter, Qley and I were preparing for war. The hospital where the switch had occurred was terrified of the impending legal nightmare and had reached out to initiate settlement talks. I hired Marcus Vance, one of the most ruthless, highly respected medical malpractice and estate attorneys in the state. Marcus met with Qley and me in my apartment, presenting a detailed breakdown of the legal strategy. Because the hospital's negligence directly led to Qley's medical records being mismatched, her kidney condition had been misdiagnosed for years. This gross negligence had directly caused her kidney failure, meaning Qley was the primary victim entitled to physical and emotional damages. The hospital is prepared to offer a private settlement of $4.5 million to avoid a public trial, Marcus explained. However, because your parents raised her during her minor years, they are attempting to claim 70% of that settlement. They have filed a motion claiming they are the rightful recipients of the funds as compensation for the cost of raising the wrong child. My hands shook with rage as I listened to Marcus outline my parents' sickening greed. They did not want Qley to have the money for her life-saving transplant. They wanted to hand it over to their precious new biological daughter. They will not get a single dime of Qley's money, I told Marcus, my voice cold and determined. We will fight them in court, we will expose their child abandonment, and we will make sure they are left with nothing. 2 days later, my parents and Maya showed up at my apartment building, bypassing the front desk by lying to the security guard. I opened my door to find Evelyn, Richard, and a young woman with heavy makeup and designer clothes standing in the hallway. The young woman was Maya, and she was looking around my modest apartment hallway with a look of intense condescension. "Leo, we need to speak to you," and that girl immediately, Richard demanded, attempting to push past me into my home. I planted my foot firmly in the doorway, blocking his path, my eyes locking onto his with pure hatred. "You do not step foot in my home, and you do not speak to Qley," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "State your business and get the hell out of here before I call the police and have you dragged out in handcuffs." Maya stepped forward, putting on a sweet, manipulative smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Hi, Leo. I am Maya, your actual sister," she said, her voice dripping with fake warmth. "I just think it is so sad that we are fighting like this when we are real family, and we really need to settle this settlement issue. Our parents raised that girl for 22 years, so it is only fair that they get the majority of the hospital money to reimburse them. Besides, I have some incredible business ventures that could benefit the whole family, including you, if we just cooperate. I looked at Maya, seeing right through her pathetic, transparent act, and let out a dry, humorless laugh. You are a disowned con artist who stole from her own adoptive family, and you're currently running from 3 different lawsuits in Illinois, I said calmly. Maya's fake smile instantly froze, and the color drained from her face as she stared at me in absolute shock. Evelyn's eyes widened in fury, and she pointed a finger at me, screaming so loudly that the neighbors' doors began to crack open. "How dare you lie about your sister, you jealous, bitter boy," Evelyn shrieked. "Maya is a successful business owner, and she has more class in her pinky finger than that orphan you are harboring in there." "We are here to offer you a deal," Richard interrupted, throwing a legal document onto my entryway table. "If Qley signs over 90% of the settlement to us, we will agree not to sue her for the cost of her childhood upbringing. If she refuses, we will file a lawsuit that will tie up that settlement money in court for years, and she will die before she ever sees a penny of it." They were using my sister's literal survival as a bargaining chip to extort millions of dollars from her. Qley, who had been listening from the living room, slowly walked to the doorway, holding onto the wall for support. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with a quiet strength I had not seen in her since this nightmare began. "I will never sign your papers," Qley said, her voice steady and clear despite her physical weakness. "You threw me out like trash when I was dying, and you are not my parents. You are just 2 greedy strangers. I hope you enjoy your new daughter, because she's going to take everything you have, and you deserve every bit of it." Evelyn lunged forward as if she wanted to strike Qley, but I stepped in front of her, grabbing her wrist in a tight, unyielding grip. "Touch her, and I swear to God you will not walk out of this building on your own 2 feet, I whispered in her ear. I shoved her back into the hallway, grabbed the extortion documents from the table, and slammed the heavy door in their faces. Through the peephole, I watched Richard pounding on the door for a few seconds before Maya pulled him away, whispering frantically in his ear. The next morning, I met with Marcus and our estate lawyer, Clara, to prepare our counterattack. Clara had been monitoring my parents' financial activities and noticed some highly suspicious movements in their family trust. "Your grandfather left a historic lakefront cabin in Lake Tahoe to you, Leo, which is currently worth about $1.8 million. Clara explained. "Because the title was held in a family trust managed by your father, he has just attempted to file a deed transfer. He is claiming that your grandfather signed a secret codicil to his will 24 years ago, leaving the cabin to Richard's direct biological heirs. They are trying to use this forged document to strip you of your inheritance and hand the Lake Tahoe cabin over to Maya." I felt a cold rage settle over me as I looked at the forged signature of my late grandfather on the deed transfer document. My grandfather had absolutely adored Qley and me, and he had despised Richard's greedy, superficial nature. He would have never signed such a document, and the signature was a clumsy, amateurish forgery that was clearly Maya's handiwork. "We're not going to stop them from filing it, Clara," I said, a dark smile spreading across my face. "We're going to let them file the forged document, and the moment they do, we're going to hit them, let them think they are winning, let them get comfortable, and then we will drop the hammer on all of them." Over the next 3 weeks, Maya's influence over my parents grew even more toxic and destructive. She convinced Richard to liquidate a large portion of his retirement portfolio to invest in her fake luxury clothing brand. My private investigator tracked Maya as she transferred those funds directly into an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. She was planning her exit strategy, intending to bleed my parents completely dry before fleeing the country when the law caught up to her. Meanwhile, Qley's condition was deteriorating, and she was placed on daily dialysis, which was exhausting her fragile body. But amidst the darkness, we got a miracle. A young woman from another state who had read about Qley's story online offered to be an altruistic donor. The donor, Sarah, was a perfect match, and the hospital agreed to fast-track the transplant surgery. When my parents found out about the impending surgery and the fact that the $4.5 million settlement was about to be finalized, they panicked. They knew that once the settlement was paid out to Qley's medical trust, they would never be able to touch a single penny of it. Maya, desperate to secure the bag before her scams were exposed, convinced my parents to execute a highly illegal, desperate plan. They attempted to hire a corrupt notary public, a man named Donald who had a history of losing his license for fraudulent activities. They planned to create a forged medical power of attorney, claiming Qley was medically incompetent due to her advanced kidney failure. This document would give Evelyn and Richard full control over Qley's legal and financial decisions, allowing them to sign the settlement on her behalf. What my parents did not know was that Donald, the corrupt notary, had been under federal investigation for financial fraud for over a year. My lawyer, Marcus, had connections in the state prosecutor's office, and they had been tapping Donald's communications. The moment Richard reached out to Donald to arrange the forgery, the authorities were notified, and they contacted us immediately. "We have them, Leo," Marcus told me over the phone, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. "The state police and the financial crimes unit want to set a sting operation, and they need your cooperation. They're going to let the meeting happen at the bank where your parents intend to present the forged power of attorney to execute the wire transfer." I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders, replaced by a cold, burning anticipation for the downfall of the people who ruined my sister's life. I looked over at Qley, who was resting on the sofa, her face looking peaceful for the first time in months. "We're going to finish this, Qley," I whispered to her, kissing her forehead before walking out to meet the detectives. The sting was set for Thursday morning at the main branch of the downtown bank, where my parents held their primary accounts. I arrived early with Clara and Marcus, taking our seats in a glass-walled conference room on the second floor, overlooking the main lobby. 3 plainclothes detectives were positioned around the lobby, pretending to fill out paperwork and waiting for the signal. At exactly 10 o'clock, the glass doors of the bank slid open, and my parents walked in, flanked by Maya and Donald, the corrupt notary. Evelyn was dressed in a white designer trench coat, her chin held high as she walked with an air of unearned royalty. Maya was clutching a high-end designer handbag, looking around nervously, her eyes darting toward the security guards. Richard carried a leather briefcase, his face set in a grim, determined expression of arrogance and greed. They were escorted into a private office on the ground floor by the branch manager, who had been fully briefed by the police and was cooperating. Inside the office, the manager sat across from them, reviewing the forged medical power of attorney and the settlement transfer forms. "Are you absolutely sure that Qley is unable to sign these documents herself?" the manager asked, his voice calm and professional. "Yes, she is completely incapacitated," Evelyn lied smoothly, wiping a fake tear from her eye. "It is such a tragedy, but as her loving parents, we must take over her affairs to ensure her medical bills are paid." The manager nodded, pretending to verify the notary stamp provided by Donald, who was sweating profusely in his cheap suit. "And you wish to transfer the initial payment of $2 million to this offshore account in the Cayman Islands immediately?" the manager asked, looking at Maya. "Yes, that is correct," Richard replied, leaning forward. "It is for a family investment trust managed by my daughter, Maya." The manager reached under his desk and pressed the silent alarm, which alerted the detectives waiting in the lobby. He then walked out of the office under the pretense of getting the final approval from the wire transfer department. The moment the door closed behind the manager, the 3 plainclothes detectives walked in, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Richard stood up, his face flushing with anger as he glared at the officers. "What is the meaning of this? We are in the middle of a private financial transaction," Richard demanded, his voice booming. "Richard and Evelyn, you're under arrest for grand larceny, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud," the lead detective announced. Maya's eyes went wide with terror, and she immediately dropped her designer bag, backing away toward the window. "This has nothing to do with me. I did not know they forged those papers," Maya screamed, her voice cracking as she tried to save herself. They forced me to come here. They're the ones who wanted the money, she yelled, pointing at Evelyn and Richard. Evelyn stared at her biological daughter in utter disbelief, her jaw dropping as she realized the girl she had praised was throwing her to the wolves. Maya, how can you say that? You were the one who came up with this entire plan, Evelyn shrieked, her voice reaching a manic pitch. We did all of this for you. We bought you a car. We gave you $50,000, and you are betraying us. The detectives did not waste any time. They grabbed Maya's arms, pulling them behind her back, and clicked the metal handcuffs into place. Maya began to scream and thrash, her carefully cultivated image of elegance completely shattering into a sobbing, hysterical mess. Evelyn and Richard were handcuffed next, their wrists bound tightly behind their backs as they were led out of the glass office. I walked down the stairs from the second floor, standing in the middle of the lobby as my parents and Maya were escorted out. Richard looked up and saw me, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage, humiliation, and desperation. Leo, you did this, you sick, disloyal bastard, Richard roared, trying to lung toward me before a detective pulled him back. We raised you. We gave you everything, and you side with that worthless, fake sister over your own flesh and blood. I stood my ground, looking down at my father with nothing but cold indifference and pity. You raised me to value family, Richard, but you forgot that family is built on love and loyalty, not a bloodline, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet bank. Qley is my sister, and she always will be, but as of today, you two are absolutely nothing to me. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, but there was no remorse in them, only the realization that she had lost everything. Please, Leo, do not do this to us. We are your parents, she whimpered as she was nudged toward the exit. I turned my back on them, walking away as the police led them out into the bright morning light, where news cameras were already waiting. The scandal of the prominent local couple arresting for attempting to steal their dying daughter's settlement blew up in the local media. The country club elite, whom my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress, immediately ostracized them, scrubbing their names from every committee. The criminal trial that followed was a masterclass in absolute, beautiful karma. To save her own skin, Maya immediately took a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Evelyn and Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence. In her testimony, Maya detailed exactly how she had manipulated my parents, exposing their deep-seated greed and their utter lack of empathy for Qley. She admitted to forging my grandfather's signature on the Lake Tahoe cabin deed and planning the entire settlement theft scheme. During the trial, Evelyn and Richard sat at the defense table, looking haggard, broken, and 20 years older than they actually were. They had to endure the public playback of the audio recordings my private investigator had gathered, proving their malicious intent. The jury took less than 2 hours to find Evelyn and Richard guilty on all counts of grand larceny, identity theft, and conspiracy. Because of the severity of the crime and their lack of remorse, the judge handed down a devastating sentence. Richard was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, while Evelyn was sentenced to 8 years in a medium-security facility. Their estate was seized and liquidated to pay for the court costs, restitution to the victims of Maya's prior scams, and legal fees. They were left completely bankrupt, stripped of their precious mansion, their luxury cars, and their high society status. Maya did not escape her karma either. During her sentencing, the Illinois prosecutors presented evidence of her prior embezzlement. Her plea deal was partially revoked due to her withholding information, and she was sentenced to 6 years in state prison. As for Qley and me, our lives took a path of beautiful, peaceful healing. 3 days after our parents were sentenced, Qley went into surgery for her kidney transplant. The surgery was a massive, flawless success, and Sarah's kidney began functioning perfectly in Qley's body almost immediately. I watched the color return to my sister's cheeks, her bright, beautiful smile finally returning after months of agonizing pain. When the hospital settlement of $4.5 million was finalized, it was placed into a secure trust managed by Qley and Marcus. Qley was financially secure for the rest of her life, with every medical need fully covered and enough wealth to pursue any dream she wanted. We sold my apartment and my grandfather's Lake Tahoe cabin, using the proceeds to buy a beautiful, sprawling estate near the coast. We built a gorgeous home surrounded by giant pine trees, with a view of the blue ocean and a massive garden where Qley could paint. Last night, we sat on our wooden deck, wrapped in warm blankets, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Qley looked over at me, her eyes clear, healthy, and filled with a deep, unbreakable peace. "Thank you for saving my life, Leo," she whispered, leaning her head against my shoulder. I smiled, wrapping my arm around her, knowing that no DNA test could ever change the truth of who we were. "You do not need to thank me, Qley," I said softly, looking out at the peaceful ocean. "We are family, and nothing in this world will ever change that." The peaceful silence of our new coastal sanctuary did not last as long as we had hoped. 2 months after we moved into our oceanfront home, a sleek black sedan pulled up our long, gravel driveway. I was in the garden helping Qley plant a row of white hydrangeas when Marcus Vance stepped out of the back seat, holding a thick leather portfolio. He did not have his usual confident, sharp courtroom smile. Instead, his face was tight with a mixture of anxiety and deep gravity. "We need to speak inside, Leo, and Qley needs to hear this too," Marcus said, looking around our peaceful yard with a cautious sigh. We sat around our oak dining table, the smell of salt water drifting through the open windows, as Marcus laid out a fresh stack of legal documents. "Your parents' trial may be over, but the fallout from the hospital switch has just entered a highly volatile new phase," Marcus began. "The couple who raised Maya, the wealthy real estate magnates Arthur and Eleanor Sterling, have formally reached out to my office. They have spent the last 6 months in utter devastation after realizing the girl they poured their lives into was a criminal sociopath who devastated their family. Now, they know the truth about Qley, and they are desperate to meet their real, biological daughter." Qley's hand instantly went to her chest, her fingers pressing against the area where her new kidney was quietly doing its life-saving work. I looked at her pale face, seeing the sudden wave of fear and anxiety washing over her beautiful features. "I do not know if I can do this, Leo," Qley whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at me for guidance. "My parents threw me away because of blood, and now these strangers want me just because of blood. What if they're just like Evelyn and Richard? What if they look at me and only see a disappointment compared to the wealthy life they wanted?" She cried. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, ensuring my voice was a steady anchor for her swirling emotions. "You do not have to do anything you are not ready for, Qley, and no one can force you to see them," I assured her. But Marcus did not stop there. He slid another document across the table, this one bearing the official letterhead of a high-end corporate law firm. "There is a complication, and his name is Julian Sterling," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. "Julian is Arthur Sterling's nephew, and for the last 10 years, he has been positioned as the sole heir to the Sterling real estate empire. With Maya disowned and out of the picture, Julian was guaranteed to inherit a fortune estimated at over $80 million. Now that Qley has emerged as the true biological daughter, Julian sees her as an existential threat to his inheritance. He has already hired a team of aggressive corporate lawyers and private investigators to dig into Qley's life," Marcus explained. "Julian is preparing to file a preemptive lawsuit to block Qley from ever being recognized as an heir to the Sterling family trust. He is planning to claim that Qley is an opportunistic fraud who colluded with Evelyn and Richard to orchestrate the entire switch narrative." A cold, familiar anger began to pool in my stomach as I listened to Marcus describe this new predator circling my sister. It seemed that no matter where we went, greedy vultures were always trying to tear Qley down for money she did not even ask for. "Let him try," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as I looked at Marcus. "We survived my parents, we survived Maya, and we will absolutely crush this arrogant nephew if he tries to touch my sister." Qley sat in silence for a long time, looking out the window at the crashing waves before she finally turned back to us. "I want to meet Arthur and Eleanor," Qley said, her voice suddenly finding a quiet, steel-like resolve. "Not for the money, and not because of some trust fund, but because I want to look them in the eyes and see if they are real. But I will only do it if Leo is standing right next to me the entire time." Marcus nodded in agreement, immediately picking up his phone to arrange a meeting at a highly secure, private dining room in San Francisco. The meeting was set for the following Saturday at a historic, members-only club overlooking the bay. When we arrived, the tension in the private room was so thick it was almost difficult to breathe. Arthur and Eleanor Sterling were already sitting at the long mahogany table, looking incredibly elegant, but visibly worn by years of grief. The moment we walked through the door, Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears immediately welled in her eyes. The physical resemblance between Eleanor and Qley was absolutely staggering. They had the exact same high cheekbones and soft, expressive green eyes. Arthur slowly stood up, his tall frame shaking slightly as he stared at the daughter he had lost 22 years ago. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. "You look just like my mother." Qley stopped in her tracks, her breathing shallow as she looked at the woman who had carried her into the world. Arthur looked at me, a deep respect in his tired eyes, and bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for bringing her, Leo, and thank you for protecting our daughter when we were not there to do it," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. We sat down, and for the next 2 hours, the raw, painful truth of our intertwined families was laid bare. Arthur and Eleanor explained how they had slowly watched Maya turn into a manipulative, cold stranger during her teenage years. They had spent millions on therapies, private schools, and endless bailouts, never understanding why she lacked a single ounce of empathy. When the DNA scandal broke, they realized the cruel twist of fate that had kept them from the sweet, gentle girl who actually belonged to them. "We want to make this right, Qley," Eleanor cried, reaching across the table to gently touch Qley's fingers. "We want you to be a part of our lives, our family, and we want to ensure you never have to worry about anything ever again." Before Qley could answer, the heavy double doors of the private dining room were pushed open with a loud, insolent thud. A tall man in his early 30s, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and an arrogant smirk, strolled into the room. It was Julian Sterling, and his presence immediately shattered the fragile, emotional atmosphere of the reunion. "Well, isn't this a touching family portrait?" Julian sneered, pulling out a chair and sitting down without being invited. "Uncle Arthur, Aunt Eleanor, I told you not to rush into this little circus without letting my legal team vet these people first. How do we know this girl isn't just another grifter looking for a payday, just like the sister she grew up with?" Julian laughed. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor as I locked my eyes on a Julian's smug face. "Get out of this room before I throw you through that glass window," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he let out a dry, condescending chuckle. "Oh, look, the protective fake brother is playing the tough guy," Julian mocked, leaning back in his chair. "You and your little sister got a nice $4 million payout from the hospital. But don't think you're going to slide your way into the Sterling fortune. I have already filed a formal petition with the probate court to freeze any modifications to the family trust pending a full psychological and genetic investigation." Arthur slammed his fist onto the table, his face flushing dark red with a rare, explosive anger. "That is enough, Julian," Arthur roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the table. "Qley is my biological daughter, and you have absolutely no right to speak to her or Leo in this manner. You do not control this family, and you do not control my estate." Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, his eyes turning cold and vicious as he looked at Arthur. "We will see about that, Uncle," Julian said, his voice dripping with venom. "The board of Sterling Development is highly concerned about your emotional stability after the Maya scandal. If you try to hand over family assets to a girl who was raised by bankrupt criminals, I will initiate a shareholder vote to have you removed as CEO." With that final threat, Julian turned on his heel and walked out, slamming the heavy doors behind him. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly, while Arthur looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped. "I am so sorry, Qley," Arthur whispered, looking at his daughter with deep shame. "I wanted to give you peace, and instead, I have brought another monster into your life." I looked at Arthur, seeing a good man who had been pushed to his absolute limit by a lifetime of betrayal. "Julian made a massive mistake today, Arthur," I said, a cold, calculated plan already forming in my mind. "He thinks he is the smartest man in the room, but he has no idea what he has just walked into." The moment we got back to our coastal home, I went straight to my home office and booted up my secure server network. During my years as a cloud architect, I had built highly advanced, custom data tracking programs that could analyze complex digital footprints. I called my private investigator, Frank, and told him to gather every single piece of information on Julian Sterling's personal and professional life. Within 48 hours, Frank delivered a massive encrypted file containing Julian's financial records, email communications, and social circles. As I analyzed the data, a highly disturbing pattern began to emerge from the endless rows of numbers and transactions. Julian was not the brilliant, successful businessman he pretended to be to the Sterling Board of Directors. He was deeply indebted to an offshore, high-stakes sports betting syndicate operating out of Costa Rica. He had lost over $6 million in the last 18 months alone, and his creditors were growing increasingly violent and impatient. To cover his massive gambling debts, Julian had been systematically skimming money from Sterling Development's commercial construction projects. He had set up a network of shell companies in Delaware, dummy subcontractors that billed the family business for materials that were never delivered. He was embezzling millions of dollars right under Arthur's nose, and he was desperate to secure the entire estate before his massive fraud was uncovered. But Julian's desperation had driven him to make an even more dangerous, illegal move against us. The next morning, my phone rang, and the caller ID showed the name of Sarah, the young woman who had donated her kidney to Qley. "Leo, please help me," Sarah cried into the phone, her voice shaking with absolute terror. "A man came to my apartment last night. He said his name was Julian's representative. He offered me $50,000 to sign a pre-written statement claiming that you paid me under the table for my kidney. He threatened to go to the police and have me arrested for illegal organ trafficking if I didn't sign it." My heart stopped for a second before a burning, white-hot rage took over my entire body. Julian was trying to destroy the woman who had saved my sister's life, just to manufacture a scandal that would ruin Qley's reputation. "Did you sign anything, Sarah?" I asked, my voice tight and urgent. "No. I kicked him out and locked the door, but he said he would be back tonight with his lawyers," Sarah sobbed. "Listen to me very carefully, Sarah," I said, grabbing a pen and paper. "You are safe, and I am going to protect you. I want you to pack a bag and go to a hotel immediately. I will pay for everything. I'm going to handle Julian once and for all, and he will never, ever threaten you again." I immediately contacted Marcus Vance and Clara, our estate lawyer, arranging an emergency meeting at Arthur Sterling's corporate headquarters. When we walked into the grand boardroom of Sterling Development, Arthur was sitting at the head of the table, looking pale and exhausted. Julian was also there, sitting on the opposite side with a smug, victorious grin on his face, surrounded by 3 corporate lawyers. "Ah, the happy family has arrived," Julian mocked, tapping his gold pen on the polished wood. "Are you here to negotiate your surrender, Leo? Because my legal petition to freeze the trust is being filed at 5 o'clock today." I did not say a word. I simply walked to the end of the boardroom table and plugged my encrypted laptop into the massive presentation screen. The screen flickered to life, displaying a highly detailed, colored flowchart of bank accounts, shell companies, and wire transfer receipts. "What is this garbage?" Julian scoffed, though I noticed his fingers gripped his gold pen a little tighter. "This is a detailed forensic analysis of the $5.8 million you have embezzled from Sterling Development over the last 18 months, I said calmly. The room went dead silent, the only sound being the hum of the air conditioner. I pressed a button, and the screen transitioned to display the registration documents of 3 dummy corporations registered in Delaware. These companies, which you control through a series of offshore nominee directors, have billed sterling development for concrete and steel that were never delivered to the new downtown high-rise project. The money was transferred directly from these shell companies into a personal account at a bank in San Jose, Costa Rica, which was then used to pay off your debts to an illegal sports betting ring. Julian's face went from pale to an ashen, sickly gray, and his arrogant smirk completely vanished from his lips. "This is a fabrication, a pathetic attempt to blackmail me," Julian stammered, his voice rising an octave as he looked at his lawyers for help. His lawyers, however, were staring at the screen with wide, horrified eyes, realizing their client was a sinking ship. I pressed another button, and an audio file began to play through the high-end boardroom speakers. It was a recording of the conversation Julian's representative had with Sarah, the kidney donor, which my private investigator had secretly recorded from outside her apartment door. The voice of Julian's fixer was clear and unmistakable, offering $50,000 to frame Qley and Leo for illegal organ trafficking. Arthur Sterling slowly stood up from his chair, his eyes fixed on his nephew with a look of pure, unadulterated fury. "You try to frame my dying daughter," Arthur whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. "You stole from the company my father built, you threatened an innocent donor, and you tried to destroy my child." Julian stood up, his chair flying backward and crashing against the wall as he tried to back toward the exit. "Uncle, please, they're setting me up. You can't believe these frauds." Julian panicked, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The heavy boardroom doors opened, and 4 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division stepped into the room, accompanied by 2 city detectives. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for federal bank fraud, wire fraud, grand larceny, and witness intimidation," the lead agent announced, stepping forward with open handcuffs. Julian let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper as the agents grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back and clicking the cold metal cuffs onto his wrists. His lawyers did not even attempt to speak. They quietly gathered their briefcases and stepped away, completely abandoning their client. As Julian was dragged out of the boardroom, his custom suit rumpled and his face tear-stained, he looked at me with a look of pure, defeated terror. I stood at the end of the table, watching him go, feeling a deep, profound sense of justice wash over me. Arthur walked over to me, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude, and pulled me into a tight, fatherly hug. "You saved my family, Leo," Arthur choked out, his voice cracking. "You saved my daughter, and you saved my life's work." I pulled back, looking into the eyes of the man who was Qley's biological father, and smiled. "We protect our family, Arthur, no matter what it takes," I said softly. The legal fallout for Julian was swift and absolute. Faced with the overwhelming digital and financial evidence I had gathered, he pleaded guilty to all federal charges. He was sentenced to 14 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and all of his remaining personal assets were seized to pay restitution to Sterling Development. With Julian behind signs of iron, Arthur and Eleanor officially restructured the Sterling Family Trust. They legally recognized Qley as their sole biological heir, ensuring her place in their lives and their legacy was protected by an ironclad legal barrier. But Qley, being the sweet, selfless soul she had always been, refused to let the wealth change the life we had built. She insisted on using a large portion of her inheritance to establish the Sarah Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided financial support and medical care to living organ donors across the country. 2 years later, our coastal estate had transformed into a sanctuary of life, laughter, and healing. Arthur and Eleanor had built a beautiful guest house on our property, spending their weekends with us, cooking family dinners, and watching the sunset over the ocean. Sarah, fully recovered and healthy, had become one of Qley's closest friends and worked as the director of the foundation we had built together. As for our biological parents, Evelyn and Richard, They remained locked away in their cold, miserable prison cells, completely forgotten by the society they had destroyed their lives to impress. Yesterday evening, we held a massive celebration in our backyard to mark the second anniversary of Qley's successful transplant. The garden was filled with the warm glow of string lights, the sound of laughter, and the gentle music of the ocean waves. Qley stood in the center of the lawn, surrounded by Eleanor, Arthur, and Sarah, her face radiant with a health and happiness I had once feared she would never see. She looked across the yard and met my eyes, raising her glass to me with a smile that contained a lifetime of shared battles and ultimate victories. I raised my glass back to her, my heart overflowing with an absolute, beautiful peace. We had survived the darkness. We had crushed the greed of those who tried to destroy us. And we had proven that the bonds of true family could never be broken by blood or betrayal.